For those that don't know me, I'm Anthony Sena. I'm with Janssen R&D. I've been part of the OHDSI community now for 6 years. Doesn't feel like that long in a lot of respects, but I've had the privilege to contribute to a number of the open source projects that are out there in the OHDSI ecosystem, and just happy to facilitate this conversation today here with Adam. So I don't know, Adam, if you want to do a quick intro, and then I guess as folks want to ask questions or just comment, maybe they could just tell us who they are and what organization they're in, so that we don't have to maybe do a whole round of introductions while people are still coming in.
Yeah, that sounds good. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam. I work at OHDSI Data Services, and I feel like 2021 was sort of my first year really working in OHDSI, although I've been sort of aware of it and working a little bit for a few years before that. But I'm really excited about this conversation. I've been trying to contribute some to the Hades packages this last year.
Yeah, so I'm not sure where folks want to start the conversation, but the topic of today is just open source development and how do we want to collaborate, thinking about the short-term and longer-term objectives. So I'm not sure if any folks want to jump in. If not, I can maybe start, or Adam and I can start the conversation. But before we do that, anybody else want to jump in on this? Okay, so I'll say for myself, excuse me, having come into OHDSI some time ago, I found it to be a pretty steep learning curve in terms of getting involved with open source development. So there was a whole lot to learn for myself just around medical healthcare data in general, how that was used. There's a question around Usagi. We can come back to that. I was going to say, like, if you find it daunting to see where to get started, don't feel like you're alone in that. I think that's part of what we wanted to unearth here today, is ways in which it may be hard to get involved, as well as ways that you might want to contribute, but you're just not sure how to do that. So there was a question here about Usagi from Lisa, and I know I think that's maintained by Maxim, right? Who's not in this particular chat, but if you had any questions around it, we could do our best to answer the questions.
Yeah, that's my colleague Maxim. So hi everyone, I'm Kees van Bokhoven from the Hive, and Maxim is in the data standards Breakout, but he's maintaining Usagi and a number of the other open source ETL tools for OHDSI. If you have a specific question, we can discuss it, I guess, or I can introduce you to Maxim if you send me your email.
Okay, seems like maybe
I had a question about Atlas.
Okay. Sure, go ahead. I'm not sure who that was.
Okay, it's I asked in the forum and didn't get any answer. And I'm just, the thing is, I'm considering developing an extra tab in Atlas. And I just wanted to hear from someone who knows about the coding of Atlas, how complicated that would be. I know it's a vague question.
So I guess maybe to take a step back, what's the tab that you want to develop?
The idea is to enable data downloads, because we have our users create cohorts and then they want to download the patient list and they can't, or maybe even download the patient data itself. I understand this is against the very principle of Atlas, but because we are running behind VPN, we thought we could do this. Okay, so you create a cohort and you give me the cohort ID, and then I will have a script at the backend that will give you via email your patient list. And we thought, okay, let's put that as an extra tab in Atlas.
And it would be like an attachment with the patient identifiers and effectively the contents of the cohort table?
Yes, the list of patient IDs, you would just enter your cohort ID, click submit, and then you would get by email the patient IDs. So it doesn't sound too complicated, but before we decide to do that, I thought, okay, let me just try to ask the community.
Yep, I'm sorry you didn't get an answer on that. I think if I can break your
worries.
question into two parts. So number one, yeah, we, as kind of a guiding principle, we don't allow for the download of patient level data from Atlas. That's something that we've kind of steered away from as part of the development of that platform for the obvious reasons. So we don't want to have people like touching that directly. The feature that you're describing would definitely have some utility, it sounds like, in your shop. I'm not quite sure how we would do that in such a way where it might be an optional feature that people could like turn on and off depending on their institutional needs. But I guess to your other point, how would you actually go about getting this feedback and soliciting interest from others that may have a similar need and then effectively doing the development? That's been kind of a gap that we've had since we haven't had an Atlas working group for quite a while. And it's something that I'm interested in restarting in terms of the work group so that we could get these sorts of features and discussions on the table. We've tried to do some of that through GitHub, and I think it's worked semi-effectively. It's sometimes tough to keep up with some of the requests or ideas for features. So it certainly would be helpful to have a working group. And I think for myself personally, it's been hard to find the time to kind of organize and do the work that's required to keep a working group moving in the right direction. So that's part of the explanation there. In terms of actual development work, that particular feature, you would be touching a few things, right? You'd have an Atlas, an extra tab, which you'd need some skills in JavaScript, specifically the Knockout JavaScript framework. You would need to have some Java skills to actually take the requests from the front end. It sounds like either record those requests in the database, in the web API database, and ultimately shoot off an email, which, again, doesn't sound like a lot of heavy lifting in terms of coding, but just even like configuring the backend to have a SMTP server to provide the emails and that sort of thing is not something we currently have in the stack, but could be useful for others.
Okay, JavaScript development, Knockout JavaScript.
Yep, that would be for the Atlas side, and then for the backend, it's Java. We're currently using Java 8.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So a broader question is how do Atlas extensions kind of work? Because this would be probably, it sounds like this would be an extension that would just be particular to this one institution and wouldn't necessarily be added to the general open source code base because it kind of violates that key principle of not downloading data.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not proposing we adopt this. I'm just borrowing your brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good conversation piece because it does bring up the broader issue that Adam's pointing out, which is how might you add on to Atlas in such a way that it provides benefits institutionally, and then maybe longer term, how might we bring that into the platform more generally? And I don't know if I have a good answer for that, unfortunately, at this point. It's not easy to just bolt things onto Atlas. It was one of the things that we had wanted to do with the platform to make it a bit more extensible. We just have not gotten it to that point. Yeah, I think, and that's possibly where we could use some help in terms of collaborations moving forward. Like, are there folks out there that are well-versed in Java and JavaScript that could help, facilitate and move along some of these ideas to allow folks like yourself to add on these things where you can prove its value internally and then turn around to the Odyssey community and say, hey, we built this thing. If people find it useful, maybe it becomes a plugin that we could download or potentially build into the broader platform itself. I do see some notes in the chat, but I need to move this over to my other screen so I can read them.
So Jim has a question. How do we know the actual use of open source apps? For instance, how many people are really using Usagi or Atlas? Yeah, and I also would be curious about the Odyssey R packages as well. And I think that's a really good metric that we should try to capture. Is like what's the adoption of the tools and how are they being used? With R packages, we have the CRAN downloads. I don't know if we have GitHub downloads, but for everything on CRAN, I think we can track how often it's being downloaded. But for Usagi and Atlas, maybe it's a little more difficult because those are deployed inside institutions.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that one for Atlas specifically. I know a number of institutions that are attempting to use Atlas, and it does take some time to get set up, and there's different institutional requirements for going through whatever appropriate review processes before you can install software in the enterprise. So I think some of that does take some time. But in terms of an overall number, I don't have a solid number to give you.
At the 3 institutions that I have worked with with Odyssey, with the OMAP matters, all 3 eventually decided to not use Atlas to some degree because it was too complicated. And if you search online, you can see multiple institutions have developed different clinical query tools that people end up preferring because it's simpler. I understand Atlas is powerful, but at the end of the day, again, the 3 institutions decided against it because it was too complicated.
Hi, this is Jim Foss. To follow up on that, I'm curious, how people are exchanging that information, right? If it was too complicated, are they then, telling people to go out to like MedFloss to find a solution, or how are people finding other solutions?
Well, they basically don't find a solution, right? They want an analyst to run the query for them. They wish they could assemble the query. Okay, like give me patients with diabetes above 20 years old as well as this medication, and they wish they could do that. And they are told they can't do that, but when they try, they find it so complicated that they give up.
Maybe I could just drill into that particular point. Is the complexity with respect to Atlas the setup and installation of the platform, or is it the usage of the platform? Okay, so it's actual use. Okay.
Yeah. For example, there's this tool from the University of Washington called Leaf, and it tries to be what the user would wish. It's you find a code and then you drag and drop, and then you have an and an or, and everything happens in one screen, and then you can assemble a query. And then when you go to Atlas, okay, give me the patients with diabetes. All right, first I have to create a concept set, and I have to navigate relationships that I have no idea what do they mean. And then I have to create a cohort definition, and I have cohort entry, cohort exit, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. I'm just trying to find patients with diabetes. That's what go in their minds when they're trying to use Atlas. And then you have to execute the cohort, and then you have, the multiple steps in different screens.
But if they're using Atlas, they already have an OMAP data model underneath, correct? Is that a correct assumption? Right? Atlas sits on top of an OMAP data model.
Yes.
Kind of the point being is I'm in a situation where I have a very strong interest in OMAP working because we're ETLing data out of multiple systems, and we just get a hot mess. We get data in all kinds of formats and all kinds of different qualities. And taking a step back even before using Atlas and getting things into OMAP format, the question of who has diabetes, when you ask that question of an EMR, it becomes very complicated because you're not going to just have diagnosis codes that will tell you that. You're going to have things like, oh, this patient came to came to this facility and was prescribed insulin for medication, but it was never recorded that they actually had that diagnosis. Maybe insulin, maybe diabetes isn't the best example, but things like pregnancy. In our pregnancy data, we have patients that have a diagnosis of pregnancy. We have patients that don't have a diagnosis of pregnancy but have a due date. We have patients with visits that are labeled as postpartum. So with that hot mess, we really want to get away from that situation. And even getting stuff into OMAP would be a huge step because it would standardize it, and then we could standardize these queries. And then Atlas on top of that would be even better. And so it might be work up front for the people actually producing the data, but if they're generating data sets that are complicated and difficult to use, they're kind of just throwing the problem over the fence to guys like me that are using the data down the road.
I see what you mean. I think we have to distinguish what is to make the user interface easier versus clinical inference. You know, okay, the patient doesn't have a diagnosis of diabetes, but has the drug that is primarily used to treat diabetes. Therefore, you're going to use the prescription of the drug as a surrogate for the diagnosis. I understand, but that's not the case here. Let's suppose I just want to see the people with diabetes. There are multiple steps that the users have difficulty with this. And please don't get me wrong, I understand there is a reason why there are multiple steps. Maybe there is an irreducible complexity to it. And I don't have a solution for the problem. I'm just bringing a reality that I have faced at three different institutions.
Yeah, I think that the way I think about this is would never pitch Atlas for that purpose, because I don't think it's the right tool. You know, I see Atlas more as an expert user tool. If you are an epidemiologist and you're designing cohorts, you want to look at the results, you know, maybe even execute the OHDSI packages, which is technically possible. I don't know how many users really use that functionality, to be honest. But yeah, for clinicians in general at a hospital, the tool would be too complicated. I agree. I wouldn't even try to install it for that purpose. And indeed, there are many other tools. The one you mentioned is one, but for instance, HDR UK also has sort of designed their own GUI. Many people design their own click and point GUIs for being able to select cohorts. And often, because in the example that you give, part of it is the UX is too complicated, but part of it is also, I don't want to think about all these epidemiological details of entry and exit. I just want to look at diabetes users. So this is almost more of a business intelligence question, I would say, where it may make sense to have some sort of dashboarding solution, right, where you have queries of interest queued up. And maybe you discuss with an epidemiologist what this should look like if you have an OMAP data source, but you do not expose all that complexity to the clinician.
Yeah, if I could add on to what Case is bringing up here. So, and I apologize if I'm getting the names wrong, but I think it's Fabricio that's speaking here and kind of raising this point. Okay.
Yeah, people have difficulty with money.
So I would raise the question back in terms of like open source development. Does this, so if we consider Atlas a expert user system, which I agree, like building cohorts and kind of doing that work is complex. It's not just point and click. Well, there are points to click, but it's not always clear how to get to the goal that you want. But let's assume for a moment that you had your diabetes cohort that you're bringing to the table here. Your clinicians want to kind of receive information about that cohort, right? So they want to do a characterization of that cohort and browse the results and kind of get to insights faster. So perhaps that's an area for collaboration on open source development side where we say, what are the mechanisms by which we should start to characterize cohorts? Because that's been something that's been challenging me, very frankly. Like we do generate a lot of data, but it's sometimes hard to distill that down into simpler, more dashboard-like components. So is that an area where maybe folks on this call would be interested in collaborating on development opportunities there? Maybe. Sounds like
No, I agree with you.
There's a need there. Yeah, I don't know.
I would tend to, and if I'm to brainstorm for just a second, I would imagine the dashboard will be connected to the cohort you're trying to create. So if you're trying to create a cohort about diabetes, then maybe you want to know how many people have diabetes and how many are men and women. If you're looking for diabetes and hemoglobin A1C above X, then maybe you want to see a chart of the distribution of hemoglobin A1C in the entire population and a separate chart with that distribution in your cohort. So the cohort definition components are hints to what would be the most interesting things for you to want to know about your cohort, I would imagine.
Yeah, so we do generate a lot of summary statistics, or we're capable of generating a lot of summary statistics about cohorts using all of the tools, really. But the distilling that down and creating more of a standardized dashboard for a cohort is something that's been, I'd say, attempted a number of times within Atlas and even outside of Atlas. And it's, I guess, depending on the analyst, there's different needs, and even different populations will have different needs in terms of reporting. So it does present some challenges that way.
Yeah, I would like to just second what Fabricio is saying. Convey one comment from an epidemiologist who can't be in this call, but was telling me that they also felt like the tools were too complicated and heard it from other people, not just Atlas, but really kind of the OHDSI tool stack. And I've also worked in organizations where I feel like the OHDSI tools are underutilized, and there are people who are researchers who might potentially want to use the tools and maybe go down the road a little bit, but they kind of fall off the path because they run into just too many things that they have to learn in order to utilize the tool effectively. And I don't know if this is if other people have a similar experience, or there's other things we've heard, but I think this idea of like what complexity is irreducible and like inherent in the work that we have to do, and what complexity is sort of not necessarily irreducible or inherent, is an important question.
I mean, I thought the Book of OHDSI had a lot of good examples in getting you started, but I thought there was a lot of in-depth stuff that could have been gone over, either in the book or in videos. I thought Patrick's demonstration last week taught me a lot of things that I hadn't managed to figure out from playing around with it and from reading the documentation. So definitely we could use some more of demonstrations like that we can watch or read about, I think.
Are you guys aware of the Eden Academy and some of the courses that are available on the Eden Academy as it relates to Atlas and phenotype development and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, I've never heard of it.
Okay. So I'd suggest that there are some demos, or I'd say like educational materials related to using Atlas. I don't know if they go into as much detail as what Patrick did on our Halloween community call last week, but I'd certainly say those are a good place to start, but also echo the sentiment that more demonstrations and going further into detail would certainly be useful. And I guess in terms of this call, in terms of collaboration, that's something that frankly we could use some help on. So if folks want to go deeper into a particular area of the tool and we want to organize some documentation sessions, or just have folks get on the call, like I'll use Chris Knoll as a good example. Like Chris Knoll has built a number of the modules that are inside of Atlas, so it's difficult for Chris to I would say, organize and outline and record sessions to go into every detail. But if we get Chris and myself on a call for an hour and we kind of talk through what is possible to do, that may inspire some ideas and help others to record videos or tutorials or provide other materials that could be useful for the community if folks are interested in collaborating on that.
Excellent. Well, I definitely would be willing to work with doing something very in-depth on feature analysis. I've been asked to develop some custom features for us, and that's going to require, doing SQL because they want to do some cost analysis using features, and it's not going to be an easy task.
Yeah, and would this be, I guess, maybe it's something we could discuss offline, but the ways in which you would build those features, are you planning to use Atlas or go outside of Atlas, or is that still to be determined?
Oh, no, they want it inside of Atlas.
Okay.
So at the worst, I may have to create another temp table off to the side to use some of the work so I don't have to do all the heavy lifting, but I'm going to try and stick with the OMAP tables, at least initially.
Okay. That sounds good.
So Sena, there is functionality in Atlas to define custom features like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. You can actually define a custom feature that uses custom SQL, because I'm almost positive we don't have any custom features natively that use the cost table or cost. I think it's now a single cost table. So that would be something that would require extension and some coding, and yeah, that.
Yeah, we've developed a number of simple custom features based off the few examples, but this cost one's a lot more challenging.
Yeah, I don't use the cost table much at all myself, so I would imagine that there's going to be some complexity there in terms of computing costs.
Anywhere I can find information about that feature of custom SQL?
That's a good question. I know that if you go into Atlas and you go under the characterization tab, you can define a new feature, and under there's basically two flavors. There's a criteria builder, which is going to use a very similar mechanism to creating criteria as you would when you're developing a cohort definition. And then I believe it's just a separate tab that you toggle where instead of building the criteria, you just say dump in some SQL code to define the feature. And then that's basically giving you access to effectively the cohort table that's going to be characterized, and then the rest of the CDM tables that you could use to create whatever features you want.
Yeah, and there's a nice template of SQL that shows up there with an example one that you can use as a template to try and build yours off of, showing you how to use the variables.
Is it also possible to create your own feature for cohort definition? Let's say I have a SQL query and I want that to be one of the criteria.
That is not currently supported. So at the moment, it's kind of a flavor of building a feature as part of the characterization, not necessarily building the cohort itself. Like the moment you want to use custom SQL, you kind of have to step out of Atlas to build the cohort, unfortunately.
I see.
So if someone wanted to build sort of micro applications to do specific tasks that are a subset of what Atlas can do, in theory, you could also leverage Web API directly and build a different front end, right? Are there any examples of people having done that?
I feel like they are, but I am blanking on what they are. But I can say historically, like if I think back to the time before Atlas, there were separate applications that were used to kind of do discrete tasks. So maybe to your point, Case, that there was a application called Cersei, or the Cersei UI as it's listed in GitHub, was used exclusively for cohort building. And it leverages the Cersei Java application, which is effectively the standardized representation of a cohort that we use inside of Atlas. So if you take the two in conjunction with one another, you could kind of consider the CIRCE application as a mechanism for building cohorts using the same standardized representation. Albeit it's many years old now, but the idea follows the same. It follows the idea that you could create a separate application that's going to basically produce the same sort of standardized representation of the cohort. Tripping over my tongue here.
Right, and also maybe going back to the user experience point, I think the user experience of Atlas could be improved, but it would take a lot of work. I'm also not sure, with the framework that's used, to what extent that maybe is limiting and all the code that's already there in major redesigns. I imagine that would be difficult. And given that we have sort of limited developer capacity in the OHDSI community and all the great work that the J&J team is doing, to do a very substantial effort to redo the interface with a better UX probably doesn't make sense as an investment case, right? So I think that it would also need to come from some others in the community or a wider group if we really wanted to go there. And for the purposes of OHDSI, I'm also not really sure that it's needed, because if people are sort of willing to put in the effort to learn Atlas, which is not, it's maybe not the easiest tool in the world to use, but it's also not, compared to everything you have to learn about epidemiology and OMAP and the nuances of phenotype definition, it's probably not the biggest deal. And it's already a nice web app. So I feel that just in the grand scheme of things, like, where do we point the limited developer resources that we have in the community? Trying to put a whole lot of emphasis on redoing the UX of Atlas may not make sense. But I'm also curious what you think, Anthony.
Yeah, I know that from my experience, right, Atlas is a kind of a tool built by developers that suits the needs of exposing functionality, but it's not maybe designed in a way that fits the workflows and the way that people want to work with the tool. So I know in a couple of years back, there were some folks that were interested in kind of improving the user experience of Atlas and kind of starting from the very beginning, where it's not a technical task, so to speak, to think about the user experience. It's more of a design exercise, like crafting wireframes and thinking about what are the processes, how does the application, form itself to fit into those processes, and then ultimately, like, that would then generate a whole lot of like coding requirements and tasks. So I don't know if folks are interested in that sort of opportunity to collaborate, because maybe there are ways in which we can think about the user experience of Atlas, the audience in which it serves, and then how to bring together those elements. So Case, you had made a good point earlier, like Atlas is kind of an expert tool. Like, you need to have some education and experience in using the tool, as well as all of the epidemiological design considerations there, right? Maybe there is a simplified version that is more for clinicians, that people would want to think through, what does the user experience look like for them? And that could be its own exercise before we even have to dive into any development, if people are interested in kind of going down that road. Not sure what others think of that, but I myself do not have a strong background in user experience. I've always taken for granted that there are some really smart user design firms and people that can kind of think at that level. And I've always been on kind of the other receiving end of that, to say, like, now that we have the design and people feel comfortable with how they're going to use the system, now let's go and build it. And I'm sorry if I'm missing things in the chat, but I just, my camera's on my laptop and the screen is a lot smaller, so I can't read the chat. So I have to keep flipping things around.
There's a question how the methods library compares to Atlas. I think Atlas is just yeah, you can design cohorts with it. Theoretically, you could do it. Cohort methods is really an R packages library. So there are some R packages that would allow you to, for instance, use the web API, but I don't think they can be directly compared.
So one
Yeah.
of the, go ahead,
Sorry.
Sena.
I was just going to say it is hard to make the comparison, but sorry to jump in there, Adam. Go ahead.
Okay, this is great. Actually, Lisa's bringing up this point. Can users build cohorts in a simpler way, or like, is there another way to build cohorts? And we have Martin on the call, who's author of the Caper package, and one of the I've been looking at this lately, and I talked with Martin. This is something I think that should be on the roadmap, and I think is on the roadmap for next year, is like getting Caper into Hades. And Caper is a tool where you can define cohort definitions in R using R code, and maybe that is another avenue to have to build cohorts that could be simpler than Atlas, or just an alternative. And then someone's bringing up criteria to query, which is really a cool tool. And this is like an kind of an NLP type tool that will build the Atlas cohort and kind of point you over to Atlas based on a free text definition.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the year when we had one of the previous Odyssey symposiums. Criteria to query was demoed as part of one of the sessions, and it's really cool to kind of see it in action. I believe it was developed with the idea that you can go to a clinical study, kind of pull up the inclusion criteria for the cohort, and then it translates it into a workable definition. So pretty powerful stuff. Excuse me.
That's right. And I think if Martin saying, oh, what do the users want? I think that could be a reference. The users want to treat it like it were a clinical trial. And if you look at a clinical trial, clinicaltrials.gov, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, I assume that's where the users are coming from. They are coming with that kind of thing in mind.
So they're coming with that in mind, but it's then difficult to make the leap into the tools to say, now how do I actually create the criteria? Correct?
Yes. And I understand user interface development is extremely hard. And on top of that, everyone today is spoiled by the big tech companies that spend millions of dollars developing amazing user interfaces, and then we take them for granted, right? Every app on the phone has a wonderful interface. So it's not our reality. We have a limited development capacity, as they said.
Yep, but I think the point's important enough where if folks wanted to think through this problem, like I know we're not Google and other big tech companies, but certainly amongst the community, there's enough expertise to think through what are the barriers to entry, right? So if we kind of start from a place of what's the use case that a clinician is going to come in and want to either take an existing query, because thinking about like the phenotype development that's also happening in the community, like hopefully we get to a point where we're not starting every cohort from scratch. Hopefully there would be a diabetes care cohort, for example, that you could modify to make an age restriction or sex restriction or whatever the case may be. And maybe that becomes the use case that we need to think about as a open source development group, because then maybe we can create a simpler cohort building tool as opposed to what currently exists. Not sure if there's an interest in that here, but it certainly sounds like it would be an opportunity if folks wanted to collaborate on that.
Just before this call, I was in a Global Alliance for Genomics and Health meeting, which was about, can we create tool-independent phenotype definitions between what Entry-C is doing, HTR UK, and of course OMAP, so I showed the way it works in Odyssey. But yeah, we're not sure yet if that's possible, but we're gonna research that. So yeah, definitely, I think to answer your question, Anthony, there's an interest in on the information and data level, as well as on the tool level to build more, because this is a very big clinical need.
So it feels like it would make sense to maybe do some work together to figure out what are the ways in which we might have a more simplified process for either building a cohort from scratch or having the use case of like taking something that already exists, modifying it, and making use of it. So to Fabrizio's point, like it's not clear that you would build something, generate it, then analyze it. Like that maybe could be just a 3-step process that people would need to follow, but the tool would guide them through that process. And then it also sounds like in his case, like download the data and potentially do further analysis if necessary. But maybe that's something apart from Atlas altogether. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We're a minute over. I don't know if anyone had any last parting thoughts, but I just wanted to say thanks for a good conversation here. We can.
Thanks to you for the conversation.
Yeah, happy to do it. Any parting thoughts? Okay, well then, thanks everyone and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye now.